and welcome to the Old Library at London's Guildhall, where we're all waiting to hear who'll be the winner of this year's Booker Prize. The award will be presented here, live, in about 40 minutes. The Booker is Britain's best-known literary award and the most controversial. It's worth £15,000, and that's just the start of it. And it's accompanied each autumn by a wash of consternation, rumours and guesswork. The prize is meant to be for the best novel published in the United Kingdom during the last year by an author from the Commonwealth, the Republic of Ireland, Pakistan or South Africa. Over the last few months, the judges have had to read 103 novels, and a month ago they selected their shortlist. The 6 choices are Peter Carey, a young Australian who lives in Sydney. He's worked in advertising, he's written short stories, and one earlier novel. His book is called Iliwaka. J.L. Carr, who comes from the North Riding and now lives in Northamptonshire. He's been a teacher, had his own small publishing business, and he's a novelist and writer for children. The title of his shortlisted novel is The Battle of Pollock's Crossing. Kerry Hume is unfortunately unable to be here tonight. She lives in New Zealand and is of part Maori ancestry. Her book is The Bone People. Doris Lessing is one of the world's best-known novelists. She comes from what's now Zimbabwe and has lived in England since the 1950s. Her book is The Good Terrorist. Jan Morris lives in Wales and is one of Britain's most distinguished travel writers. Her book, Last Letters from Havre, is her first novel. Iris Murdoch, like Doris Lessing, is a novelist of worldwide reputation. Her book is The Good Apprentice, and it's her 22nd novel. This year, the Booker has been judged by a panel of 5. At times, the panels have been as controversial as the shortlist, but this looks basically solid enough. The chairman of the judges is the Right Honourable Norman St John Stevens, a former Minister of the Arts who's also an author, editor and journalist. The other judges are Nina Borden, who's well known as a novelist, as a writer for children and as a reviewer for the Daily Telegraph, J.W. Lambert, who was for many years the arts and literary editor of the Sunday Times and now sits on a number of panels and arts trusts. Joanna Lumley, the actress, has also been judging the prize, but unfortunately she can't be here tonight. Marina Warner, who's an author and critic and has written books on the cult of the Virgin Mary, Joan of Arc, and her latest book is called The Female Force. Every year people complain that the Booker Prize is turning the writing and reading of fiction into a publisher's horse race. With me now is Matthew Evans, the chairman of Faber and Faber. Matthew, do you think that publishers are now looking for Booker Prize material in the novels?
No, not at all. I think, every publisher looks for good writing, good creative writing to publish, and the Booker show, as one could call it, is really an event, an annual event. We can't determine what we publish by the requirements of the Booker Prize, and this is just a good evening. It's the theatre has the Sweats Awards and we have the Booker Prize, but we leave tonight and we forget about it for a year and we get on with making editorial decisions about writings we're offered.
But it can radically change an author's commercial life and the amount of public he or she reaches, as we saw last year with Anita Brooklyn.
Yes.
And does it never cross your lips in an editorial then that this might be good Booker Prize material?
Well, I think, if one works for a publisher that publishes literary fiction, you tend to publish the type of book that will be a contender for the Booker Prize. But, certainly at Faber's, I've never heard anybody say, and I'm sure this is true of other British publishing houses, let's take this on because it stands a chance with the Booker Prize.
So there's no sense in which a sort of Booker Prize type novel is emerging?
No, I don't think there is a Booker Prize type novel. I think in your introduction you talked about the judges, and it's really the judges that determine what's chosen. We continue publishing, and every year 5 judges make a highly subjective judgment on what should be on the shortlist. All of us disagree with it, in the press, in publishing, in the media generally. And we don't take it that seriously.
Well, there you go. Now here's Hermione Lee back in the studio to introduce the 6 authors, each talking about his or her own book.
Thank you. We begin alphabetically with Peter Carey. His short stories, Exotic Pleasures, and his first novel, Bliss, were praised for their surreal, inventive comedy. Iliwaka is a huge, funny, picaresque epic of 20th century Australia, whose narrator, Herbert Badgery, is a 139-year-old confidence trickster, home builder, bigamist, aeronaut and anglophobe. This is how Peter Carey described his central character.
Herbert Badgery is an Iliwaka. An Iliwaka in Australian slang anyway is somebody who's a confidence man, a trickster and a liar. And what this common confidence man or trickster or liar discovers is that his lies keep on coming true. And he begins by lying about this great Australian aeroplane he wants to build somewhere in 1991. And discovers the damn thing nearly comes true. And from these very optimistic beginnings, which I think reflect the optimism of that period, we move through by the end of the book to find that Herbert and his family are selling and exporting Australian animals and birds as pets, and they've become prisoners of their own pet factory and pet shop. And this, of course, has certain allegorical resonances, at least, and probably reflects on one of the great lies which the book, I think, examines, which is that Australians see themselves as a proud and free and anti-authoritarian people. And I think Herbert Badger and perhaps even the author thinks it's possibly not true.
J.L. Carr has written 5 novels. His last, A Month in the Country, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1980. It's a quite absorbing story set after the Great War about an artist restoring a painting in a Yorkshire church. The Battle of Pollock's Crossing is concise and deceptively jolly in tone. Its hero's comic visit to America turns into a dark and alarming story of violence and betrayal. He began by telling us when his novel is set.
Well, it happened in 1929. A young Yorkshireman called George Gidner felt that he must go and live somewhere else. He found himself teaching school in Dakota on the prairie. And roughly the story is what happened to him there. He found that the Americans are as foreign to him, although he could speak the language, as outer Mongolians. Life becomes even more complicated when he's cornered by a banker who's living a fantasy life of his own in an England that never was, though he never went there. And George Gidner watches in appalled consternation of what goes on and what happens to him. And it all ends up in the darkness, in a store, out in the prairie at Pollock's Crossing.
Kerry Hume has written short stories and poems, but nothing on such an ambitious scale as The Bone People, which took 12 years to expand from a short story to a long novel. Part rhapsodic stream of consciousness, part down-to-earth New Zealand and Maori dialogue, is the story of a tough, solitary woman, Kerowyn, who becomes involved with a hard-drinking man and his foster child, a mute with a mysterious history. She was filmed in New Zealand talking about her book.
The Bone People is about 2 people. A man, a woman, a child. The man is Maori with a little addition of Pākehā. The woman is mainly Pākehā, but she's got a Maori influence. The child is all Pākehā. They come together, they get to know one another, they break apart in an episode of disastrous violence, and towards the end their paths are not together again. Very simple story. The book deals with aspects of New Zealand society that are generally swept under the rug, a lack of communication with one another, the violence that riddles both cultures. But the most important thing, as far as I'm concerned, is the validity and permanency of taha wairua, Maori wairua, Maori spirituality, and the way we have of looking at people in relationships and people's relationships with the land, the dead, our ancestors as well. It's, despite the violence and various gruesome bits, I find it the book of some considerable joy. People do work out their fates. It does have a kind of a happy ending. It's a recipe, I suppose, for people to be blatant individualists and still love themselves at the end. It's got good recipes for Flanders in it too.
Doris Lessing's writing began in the 1940s and includes The Golden Notebook, Martha Quest, the first of the Children of Violence series, and the Canopus in Argos novels, which began with Shikasta, and most recently 2 novels written under the pseudonym of Jane Summers. The Good Terrorist is about an immature middle-class girl, Alice, who's reacted violently against her parents and is living in a squad of self-styled revolutionaries. We asked her what inspired the novel.
It was the Harrods bombing, actually, which triggered it off. And what fascinated me about that, how it was reported in media, was it sounded like an amateur job. And I started to wonder how it could come about that an amateur group should do something on those lines. And once having started to think about it, I got completely fascinated by it. And I started to remember all kinds of things in my past that would be useful, not the use that I was once read myself in my 20s. And these groups, this kind of group, the kind of emotional patterns do keep repeated. They're repeated the whole time. You know, if you played off what you played, the same things keep happening. So I was able to draw upon that, and a lot of my friends are still very political. So I centered it on this girl, Alice, who obviously is a woman, and she's a very immature girl in herself. And what interested me about her was that she is in fact an extremely kind, caring, warm-hearted, etc. girl who is perfectly happy to blow everything up. And this combination, I think, is extremely common in revolutionaries. You'll find revolutionaries throughout the ages kind of their cats listening to Beethoven and worrying about the old woman next door, but quite happy to blow cities up or to murder people. It's interesting.
Jan Morris's books include Pax Britannica, a trilogy about the British Empire, Among the Cities, a selection of travel essays and books on Spain and Venice. Last Letters from Hav is written in the form of a straight-faced travel guide to an extraordinary anomalous city somewhere between the Mediterranean and Asia, whose culture is an amalgam of every civilization under the sun. We asked her to tell us about the book.
I'll tell you, I'd spent a lifetime really wandering around the world, looking at and writing about cities. And at the end, I've come to the conclusion that I ought to end this career. But I thought I'd like to create sort of summation of his odyssey in some way. And I thought of the idea of inventing a city into which I could insert my own emotions about cities and about many other things too. So I created a place somewhere in the Levant in which I could not only express the thing that I personally find most interesting about cities, but I could also express the conclusions that I've reached in the course of this long journey. The conclusion is this, that having written about several hundred cities in my lifetime, I really don't know anything about them whatever. So the book is an allegory of bewilderment. I'm bewildered really by cities, and I think the citizens of cities are bewildered. And I think the citizens of the world are bewildered. They don't know what's going on all around them. In this book, the narrator, which is a kind of parody of me, because part of it is a joke on me, the parody of me gets into the city and finds herself more and more tangled and embroiled and bewildered by what's going on in there. And so are the citizens around her. And the end of the book is that these huge outside forces, undefined or ill-defined, which truly exist in the world, fall upon the city in some way, I don't know exactly how, and bring it, as the narrator knew it, to an end. There are several subsidiary allegories, and one of them is that at the end, the citizens of the city themselves, who have been very, very inhibited and entangled themselves in the affairs of the city, are left to be fallen upon. But the simplest of all the citizens, who are the aboriginals of the cave country above the city, they're the only ones who seem to be about to survive in peace. They're the ones who are the closest to the animals and closest to the nature. And I have reached the conclusion that the innocent are going to inherit the earth.
Iris Murdoch's first novel, Under the Net, was published in 1954. She's produced almost a novel a year since then, one of which, The Sea, was the Booker Prize winner in 1978. She's also an Oxford philosopher and has written books on the sovereignty of good, on Sartre and on Plato. The Good Apprentice is a characteristic exploration of guilt, anxiety, adultery and moral endeavour. We asked her to describe it.
It's a story about two brothers, stepbrothers actually, one of whom is overwhelmed by guilt. He's in a very obsessed, unhappy, guilty state. And the other boy is in perhaps equal difficulties, having decided to devote his life to virtue, to becoming good, but not in the context of any religious institution, because he doesn't believe in God or anything, but just by himself. He thinks this is something that one might devote one's life to, as priests used to. And it's about religion and magic, and how religion tends to degenerate into magic, and how unlike true goodness is from magical solutions to one's difficulties and power. And the guilty boy, seeking his real father, goes away into a sort of enchanted world where this man, who's a painter, lives as a sort of strange god, a sort of maverick spiritual power, a spiritual power which has got loose and hasn't got any clear connection with the contrast between good and evil, as in Christianity. And I think the world at present is full of such powers, wild spiritual powers. And it's about the salvation, in a way, of the guilty boy, which really consists in recovery from his guilt, and the conflict between the religious person and the magical person. When the brother who's devoted to goodness comes to rescue his brother who's under an enchantment, there is a conflict between magical power and the power of good.
Those are the 6 authors on this year's shortlist. Now, back to the old library at the Guildhall.
Thanks. Well, that's the shortlist, but of course not everybody agrees with the selection. As usual, journalists on the book pages have been compiling alternative booker shortlists, as well as librarians endorse them. We've asked Claire Tomlin, the literary editor of the Sunday Times, to give her view. Now, first of all, this list has been heavily bashed, perhaps more heavily bashed than most lists. What do you think of it as a selection of books?
Well, we all know there's a lot of malice in the literary world. There's going to be flak flying, self-righteous trumpetings about the whole thing being an insult to literature. But this isn't quite fair to the judges. After all, they have to work with the books there are. You can't blame them if we haven't got War and Peace or Sons and Others on this year. 1985, we haven't got War and Peace or Sons and Others, but it's a fine vintage set of judges, incorruptible, enthusiastic, very well read, and many of them have said to me that they would have liked the shortlist to be longer.
Do you think it's a fairly well balanced list then, the six books that we've been talking about?
It is an amazingly various list, in length, in fame, in lack of fame, 2 hemispheres.
Do you think, which books do you think, passionately think, should have been on?
Well, I'm not sure that I feel passionately, but there are 1 or 2 books that I missed from it. For instance, Jonathan Rayburn's Foreign Land, a sort of hate letter to contemporary England. It's a very sour book, very well written. He's always worth reading. Then there's Alice Thomas Ellis, Unexplained Laughter, a Catholic writer. There's a singeing feeling, a burning feeling in all her books. You feel people are consigned to hell if they haven't got impeccable good taste or if they're not simple-minded, as in this book. I think she is an arresting novelist. I'd have liked to have seen her there. A.S. Byatt's Still Life is a solid chunk of a book. It's about woman's experience. Well, Radio 3 woman. It's childbirth, culture, that sort of thing. But it is an ambitious and well thought out book.
Are these the final? Are these the ones that you most miss on the list?
Well, no, I'm coming to them too. I think I've heard more people lament the omission of Peter Ackroyd's Hawksmoor than any other book. It's a difficult book. It's a mixture of gothic, horror, detective story, brilliant pastiche of 18th century London. He's really a marvellous writer.
And finally?
Most of all, I miss, personally, Anita Bruckner's book, Family and Friends. A better book even than Hotel du Lac, which won last year. She writes about agony like nobody else.
Dominic, thank you very much. Now we'll take a short break. Afterwards, our own panel, Germaine Greer, John Carey and Paul Theroux, will give their opinions on the books. Then we'll be back here live for the announcement of the winner and the presentation of the prize itself.